making a bad situation even worse. Global food and fertilizer prices were already on the rise prior to the war, with domestic food price inflation high and rising across most of the world. I mean, the reasons are many. Growth across most of the world. I mean, the reasons are many. Good morning. My name is Martin van Nieuwkoop. I'm the Global Director for Agriculture and Food at the World Bank. And I'm very pleased today to provide a presentation on the unfolding global food security crisis and the impact of the war in Ukraine at the Uzbekistan International Poverty Forum. My presentation comes in three parts. The first part covers the impacts of the war across most of the world. The reasons are many. Good morning. My name is Martin van Nieuwkoop. I'm the Global Director for Agriculture and Food at the World Bank. And I'm very pleased today to provide a presentation on the unfolding global food security crisis and the impact of the war in Ukraine at the Uzbekistan International Poverty Forum. My presentation comes in three parts. The first part covers the impacts of the war across most of the world. I mean, the reasons are many. Good morning. My name is Martin van Nieuwkoop. I'm the Global Director for Agriculture and Food at the World Bank. And I'm very pleased today, to provide a presentation on the unfolding global food security crisis and the impact of the war in Ukraine at the Uzbekistan International Poverty Forum. My presentation comes in three parts. The first part covers the impacts of the war. Across most of the world. The reasons are many. Good morning. My name is Martin van Nieuwkoop. I'm the Global Director for Agriculture and Food at the World Bank. And I'm very pleased today, to provide a presentation on the unfolding global food security crisis and the impact of the war in Ukraine at the Uzbekistan International Poverty Forum. My presentation comes in three parts. The first part covers the impacts of the war. Across most of the world. The reasons are many. Good morning. My name is Martin van Nieuwkoop. I'm the Global Director for Agriculture and Food at the World Bank. And I'm very pleased today, to provide a presentation on the unfolding global food security crisis and the impact of the war in Ukraine at the Uzbekistan International Poverty Forum. My presentation comes in three parts. The first part covers the impacts of the war. across most of the world. I mean, the reasons are many. Good morning. My name is Martin van Nieuwkoop. I'm the Global Director for Agriculture and Food at the World Bank. And I'm very pleased today to provide a presentation on the unfolding global food security crisis and the impact of the war in Ukraine at the Uzbekistan International Poverty Forum.
$525. Good morning. Good morning, dear participants of this session named Ensuring Food Security and Sustainable Jobs Through Agricultural Transformation. Assalomu alaykum, hurmatli sessiya qatnashchilari. Bu sessiyamiz juda ham muhim bo'lib hisoblanadi. Demak, hozirgi global vaziyatda, demak, o'sha food security, ya'ni oziq-ovqat xavfsizligini ta'minlash, qishloq xo'jaligini transformatsiya qilish orqali ish joylarini yaratish, odamlarning daromadini ko'paytirish, shu bilan bog'liq mavzuda muhokamalar qilamiz. Iltimos bo'ladi, hamma o'zlarini headfonlarini, ya'ni naushniklarni olib eshitib, tarjimalarni to'g'rilab olishlaringizni so'rayman, chunki asosan ingliz tilida bo'ladi muhokamalarimiz. My name is Ilhom Norkulov. I'm First Deputy Minister of Economic Development, and I was happy, to take the role of the moderator because I will try to be a moderator not in a classical way, but as I already mentioned to some of the speakers, I will try to squeeze out of everything just for the sake of help and the benefit of our country's program towards the food security and agricultural transformation. During the last 3 years, we saw how the global economy and the world, facing huge challenge towards the ensuring the food security, and high inflation rates, first of all, is showing an impact for people with low income, and it's also increasing the risk of increasing the poverty. And first of all, it was the pandemic, and now it's a difficult geopolitical situation in the world. And I would also add that global climate change that is bringing to scarcity of water, land degradation, that all is unfortunately showing that the risks are increasing. And the problems are diverse, and how we are going to address them. That's the huge challenge. And for discussing these issues and to find the way out to address these problems, especially in the context of Uzbekistan, we invite very good and experienced professionals from World Bank, Miss Frauke Jungbluss. Did I pronounce it? Yeah. And Miss Beate Shorwright. She already has a good knowledge of Uzbekistan's situation in agriculture. She's involved in different projects, and she knows the situation abroad and the global condition and international experience, and also well aware of the situation in Uzbekistan. And I'm also delighted to introduce Eric Livni. He's EBRD expert, lead regional economist for Central Asia at EBRD, saying it in the right way. And he also comes from the private sector with a rich experience in agriculture sector and SME development. And we are working with Eric on supporting private sector, especially in the agriculture sector, and working on developing the aggregator system. And today with us, Sergey Zorya, World Bank expert on agriculture issues. And Sergey was directly involved in development of the agriculture sector transformation strategy. And he was helping us in different directions in developing the programs and implementations, strengthening the legislative base, and generally in many aspects of reforming the agriculture sector. Today we are also we have a video presentation which is recorded And this presentation will be done by Global Director of the World Bank for Agriculture and Food Global Practice, Martin van Nieuwkoop. And also we have Professor Stefan von Kramen-Taubadel. He's a Dean of the Department of Agricultural Economics and Rural Development at the University of Göttingen. And also online, we will speak with Mr. Kiego Obara. He's a food security officer at FAO. So with your permission, I want to ask my colleagues to put the video presentation, which is prepared by Mr. Van Nieuwkoop. Please.
Good morning. My name is Martin van Nieuwkoop. I'm the Global Director for Agriculture and Food at the World Bank. And I'm very pleased today to provide a presentation on the unfolding global food security crisis and the impact of the war in Ukraine at the Uzbekistan International Poverty Forum. My presentation comes in three parts. The first part covers the impacts of the war in Ukraine on global food and nutrition security. The second part focuses on the impacts of the war on food security in Uzbekistan. And the third part, provides some reflections on the way forward, including the role of the World Bank. So let's move to the first part. The impacts of the war in Ukraine on global food and nutrition security. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine, could not have come at a worse time. Coming on top of existing crises in many countries, driven by climate change, conflict, and COVID-19. The impacts of the war are making a bad situation even worse. Global food and fertilizer prices were already on the rise prior to the war, with domestic food price inflation high and rising across most of the world. The reasons are many: growing demand, combined with lingering supply chain disruptions, continuing weather shocks, labor shortages, and rising energy and freight costs. High domestic food price inflation is now widespread, affecting the majority of not only low-income countries, but also middle and high-income countries, as you can see on the slide. Food price inflation is also very high in real terms. Of the 142 countries for which we have data, food price inflation exceeded overall inflation in 70%, of all countries, all cases. The expectation now is that the food security situation the world is facing, will be worse, than the food price crisis, that we saw in 2007 and 2008. Food crisis and rising prices are devastating for the poorest and most vulnerable people. And we see three major immediate and short-term risks, from the current crisis. The immediate impacts, of course, are being felt by Ukraine itself. Where millions are suddenly faced with acute food insecurity. All the countries directly and immediately impacted by the war are those with a high concentration of wheat and other food imports from Ukraine and Russia. This is a large number of countries, mostly in Middle East and North Africa, Europe and Central Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. There are also several countries in other regions with heavy concentration of wheat imports from Ukraine and Russia. So this is the first major risk, that we see. The broader impact of the war on global food prices means that a much larger group of food importing countries are also vulnerable. And this is the second major risk. Among these, the most vulnerable countries are those where already that were already suffering a high level of hunger, while at the same time being significantly dependent on food imports, to cover their annual food consumption. And this is a large number of countries, as you can see, as listed on the right upper quadrant of this slide. These countries are clearly where close monitoring is required, and responses, need to be prioritized. The third major risk we see is through the skyrocketing fertilizer prices, which will impact next season production across the majority of countries. I mean, Russia and Belarus are major global suppliers of fertilizers. Russia is also a major supplier of natural gas. And this is a key ingredient in the production and the manufacturing of fertilizers. I mean, with limited global capacity to boost supplies in the short run, and with the vast majority of countries as net importers of fertilizers, as you can see on this slide, I mean, agriculture production is at risk across a large number of countries. And this would mean a protracted and possibly growing food insecurity crisis over the next 2 to 3 years. So the consensus opinion among experts is that because of this, there is a significant risk that food insecurity will get worse before it gets better. Now, with global food markets already in turmoil, adverse policy responses in the form of trade restrictions will drive prices even further up, as was also seen during the food price crisis in 2007 and 2008. And we are already seeing this, unfortunately, happening again. I mean, since the start of the war in Ukraine, I mean, 30 countries have already imposed export bans or restrictions. And the bans on wheat exports imposed since the beginning of the war now cover 21% of world trade and are responsible for a 9 percentage point increase in world wheat prices. Also, in this respect, a sober reminder is that analysis done after the food price crisis in 2007-2008 shows that the export restrictions that were put in place at the time actually explained and accounted for 30 to 40% of the price increases of wheat and rice that they actually saw at the time. Right now, as a result, I mean, food insecurity is at its highest level observed since 2016. Acute food insecurity, both in terms of numbers of people in crisis situations and stress conditions, now stand at respectively 193 million and 236 million people. According to the FAO, I mean, nearly 1 billion people worldwide are now suffering from severe food insecurity, with the fastest growth happening in upper middle income countries, followed by lower middle income countries. So the bottom line is that the war in Ukraine is deepening, broadening, and prolonging, I mean, food insecurity in the world. So this brings me now to my second part of my presentation, which is on the impact of the war in Ukraine on food security in Uzbekistan. The World Bank is conducting regular surveys, listening to the citizens of Uzbekistan, which allows us to track, I mean, the responses of about 4,000 households in many aspects of their livelihoods, including food insecurity. And I'm using the results of the survey completed in early May, I mean, to present, I mean, the views of the participating households on food security situation in recent weeks in Uzbekistan. One finding is that more and more people agree that bread and flour prices increased in the past month. Prices of lamb and rice are also increasing, while the price of beef actually is showing somewhat of a decline. The share of people reporting not to be able to afford food increased from 15% in March, I mean, to 25% in April 2022. But this has not yet translated into significant reduction in actual food consumption. But however, I mean, this is definitely an issue to watch, I mean, moving forward. I mean, closely related to food security in Uzbekistan is the issue of remittances. I mean, they are declining, I mean, to the decline of economic activities in Russia. I mean, the survey respondents are concerned that returning migrants will not be able to find a job at home and substitute, I mean, their migrant incomes. So as a result, I mean, negative impacts are anticipated across the board. I mean, with food prices and food security dominating among people's concerns as expressed, you know, in those surveys. Now, the good news is that Uzbekistan is better positioned to handle this food insecurity crisis better than many other countries. I mean, the country produces most food products locally and in large quantities. It only depends on imports, for vegetable oils and sugar. Also, most fertilizers are produced domestically from local natural gas. Currently public stocks for grains are relatively large, and they can help mitigate, excessive wheat price spikes. Also, the State Fund for Agriculture Support under the Ministry of Finance has the existing mechanism to provide a temporarily scaled up support for the next production season. To compensate for increased cost of inputs if needed. And last but definitely not least, the government has strengthened social safety nets, and those can be used, to better mitigate, the impact of these crises on poor and vulnerable people. This brings me to the third and last part of my presentation, the way forward. Of course, before that, we should not forget, that and be reminded, that the sustainability challenges of the food systems are enormous. So we need to keep that in mind while thinking about the way forward. In that respect, the first challenge, that the food system is facing is that it will need to be able to feed 2 billion more people by 2050. The second challenge is that with business as usual, this increased global food production would cause 600 million hectares of additional deforestation. This is twice the size of India, which clearly needs to be avoided. And the third challenge would be to significantly reduce the carbon footprint of the sector so as to be in line with the 2-degree world as called for by the Paris Agreement. And this means that greenhouse gas emissions generated by the sector will need to be reduced in absolute terms from the 12 gigatons in 2010 to 4 gigatons, by 2050. And this is a massive challenge, especially considering that with business as usual, actually emissions will go up, to 15 gigatons a year. And while addressing these massive challenges, the food systems need to build up climate resilience while facing stronger headwinds because of climate change. They also need to improve nutrition and human capital and lift the many poor who work in the food system out of poverty. So keeping that in mind, what needs to be done? So we see 4 entry points in that respect. The first entry point is to keep food trade flowing and avoid adverse policies restricting exports. This needs more attention as a trend, as we indicated earlier, is in the wrong direction. G20 has a very important role to play here. Through its agricultural marketing and information system, which was set up in 2011 to closely monitor global food trade and actually name and shame countries, taking the wrong actions. The second entry point is to protect, poor consumers. This would require further scale up of nutrition sensitive social safety net. A point of concern here is that many countries are using subsidies instead of targeting social assistance to address, price increases. Of the 84 countries for which we have data, we see that 79% of them are using subsidies, while only 70% are using targeted social assistance programs, such as cash and in-kind transfers. To protect consumers, countries also might need to support, to finance, food imports. The third entry point is to ramp up support to producers to ensure next season's production by removing remaining input barriers, incentivizing more efficient use of fertilizers, explore the deployment of biofertilizers as alternative to synthetic fertilizers, addressing food loss and waste more aggressively, and repurposing existing public support, to better support farmers than is happening today. And the fourth entry point is to keep an eye on the long run by ensuring that short-term measures are consistent with and actually ideally support the longer-term green, resilient, and inclusive development agenda. And in this respect, it is important to recall, as was mentioned by the World Food Programme recently, that $1 invested in resilience is actually worth $3 spent on humanitarian assistance. A point of major concern is that many countries are now in a weaker position to respond to the crisis. Due to the worse debt and fiscal situation compared to 2017 and 2008. as indicated on this slide. And of course, this is due to the COVID response. And so in view of this, it is expected that many vulnerable countries will need external support to respond to the current food security crisis. Now, at the same time, I mean, the weak fiscal situations in many countries also offer opportunities, we think. In this respect, a bigger push towards repurposing the 640 billion in public support, I mean, that is provided to agriculture every year, is definitely something to be considered. I mean, that countries need to be looking at when responding to the current crisis. I mean, the bank recently published a study that provides a strong rationale, I mean, for doing so. For every dollar of public support to agriculture, only 35 cents actually benefited farmers, and only 1/6 of public support is geared towards supporting public goods. And with business as usual, having those policies in place, emissions in agriculture will in fact increase by 58% by 2040, and thereby, of course, further fueling, I mean, the frequency of extreme weather events with negative impacts, on agriculture. At the same time, the report indicates that repurposing public support, I mean, to agriculture can be done while avoiding trade-offs, and in fact can actually generate a triple win benefits by increasing productivity, improving resilience, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in simultaneous fashion. Responding appropriately to rising food and fertilizer prices and the food security crisis that we see now is mission critical, I mean, to the World Bank Group. So let me say a few words about our response to date and going forward. I mean, over the past 2 years, I mean, COVID disruptions slashed people's incomes and threw food systems in disarray in many parts of the world. I mean, the bank deployed over $70 billion annually in IDA and IBRD lending for food security. This was during our fiscal years 21 and 22. And this is up, compared to 12 billion, I mean, that was invested on food security on average in our fiscal years 2018 to 2020. Today, we are active discussions with particularly vulnerable import-dependent countries in the Middle East and North Africa to help finance grain imports, increase storage capacity and quality, and support regional value chains to address supply disruptions. And we expect funding for food security to be a very important dimension of the overall surge in financial support, I mean, to the tune of $170 billion that the bank recently announced moving forward. And on food, our response is guided by the belief that countries should avoid adopting beggar than neighbor policies, and that is imposing export restrictions and price controls, enabling market access, supporting food producers, and protecting the most vulnerable population through cash transfers are central to the World Bank Group response. Let me finish by saying that the bank stands ready to support countries to respond to the growing food insecurity crisis, while ensuring that this is well aligned with the longer-term agenda to increase productivity, enhance resilience, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions of the world's food systems, including in Uzbekistan, if needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Van Nieuwkoop. And now I want to turn to Stefan from the University of Göttingen. Stefan, can you hear us? Online Verblasla?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much for joining. And so what do you think, based on the current situation and coming from the presentation of Martin, what are the key challenges, from your view, from your research point of view, and where we are heading to? Basically, the presentation that Martin makes, that the situation will get worse before it gets better. It's a kind of alarming, and it gives a serious it puts serious kind of issues on agenda for policymakers, especially when you are trying to reduce the poverty, because it directly hits to the income condition of the poor households. And based on that, what's your view and vision and that recent research you are doing, and what you can share? You have 5 to 7 minutes time.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to present today. Martin Newkop's presentation was excellent and covered many of the bases, and I don't want to waste time that we could use in a discussion by repeating many of the points. The whole situation is indeed very threatening. About 10 days after Russia began its aggression, I wrote and released a paper on some of the possible implications. And the depressing thing is that step by step, many of the things that I predicted, unfortunately, have been coming to fruition. The concern that countries would use export restrictions was a big one. And unfortunately, as time goes by, as Martin showed, the IFPRI is monitoring this carefully. We see that more and more countries are indeed turning to export restrictions, which is worrisome because it simply shifts the burden to the poorest of the poor worldwide. The other thing, if I could just quickly share my screen that I wanted to show you, I'm not going to show you an entire presentation, but I did want to show you one slide, if I may, because I think it might be interesting for you, and that is this slide here, which simply shows at the moment for futures markets in Europe, the Matif wheat contract, what are the most recent prices that have been traded. And what we see is that the first set of contracts, those are the contracts for wheat prices after the harvest, which will begin very shortly here in Europe and the rest of the Northern Hemisphere. And we see that prices are going to stay for this upcoming crop year in a 400 euro range, which is like $440, $450, right? After next year's harvest, September 23 and onwards, the markets are expecting some relief. And we see that the prices for those contracts are currently being traded sort of in a 325, 330 range. And 2 years from now, after the harvest in the summer of 2024, we see prices dropping more, but we're still talking about prices that are well above 250 euros per ton, in the neighborhood of $300 per ton and more. Now, of course, these are very speculative prices at the moment, but they tell us that the markets are expecting, of course, some supply response to the current high prices, but not a very large reduction in prices back to the levels that we had a few years ago. So indeed, as you said, the challenge is huge. We are going to be dealing with tight markets and relatively high prices, at least as far as we can tell at the moment, for several years to come. Even if the aggression in Ukraine ended tomorrow, and unfortunately there seems to be no sign that that will be the case, even if it did end tomorrow and the Russian troops withdrew and we could start rebuilding, it would take a long time to repair the damage that has been done and to return Ukrainian production capacity to what it was before the aggression, and especially to return Ukrainian export infrastructure, the harbors and the rail lines and so on, to what it was before the aggression began. So indeed, we're looking at a long haul. I think the other thing that I would briefly touch upon is to confirm what Martin Newkop said about the situation in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is one of the countries for which the FAO has done some detailed analysis of import bills and what sort of assistance might be necessary. I have not been in your country, and it's been a while since I took a closer look at agriculture in your country. But my impression as well is that with your state fund for agricultural support and with your social safety nets, you are in a position much better than several other countries I can think of to take appropriate responses and to address the challenges that lie ahead. And that's the good news. The other thing that Martin mentioned at the end of his presentation is work that has to be done at a global level. We have learned from this crisis that we are vulnerable, too vulnerable. Even before the crisis began, the number of hungry worldwide was increasing. And the crisis now has made that situation much worse. So there's a lot we have to do. One thing he did not mention directly, I think, is consumption in the industrialized countries. And in recent months, the debate within Europe, for example, on what we do with food grain in particular, how we use our agricultural area, and two conflicts in particular, the conflict between food and fuel on the one hand, the fact that in Europe and North America, we do use a lot of agricultural land to produce biofuel instead of food. And the other conflict is that between you could say, food and feed. In other words, the fact that in Germany, roughly 60% of the grain that we produce is used to feed animals, which is, when you get down to it, a rather inefficient way of feeding people in the end, and has a variety of negative environmental impacts as well as health impacts as well. These are things that are being discussed with much more interest, much more controversially, much more heatedly since the Russian invasion or attempted invasion began. And that is maybe the silver lining to this cloud, the fact that the current crisis is focusing our attention on the need to address parts of the agricultural system, in particular, some of our consumption. And I'm hoping that that will, at least in the medium and long term, lead to some important changes that ultimately have very important implications and can create some significant benefits for the global food security situation overall. With your permission, I will stop at this point and thank you very much. And I look forward to the other presentations, and I'm certainly very open and eager to try to field any questions that might come along. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. And now, before turning to panel, I want to give the floor to Kigo Obara. And Kigo, are you with us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, Kigo. So, what are the projections from FAO side? So far, we are having kind of worrisome projections, and situation is not good. And what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Well, our projection is also similarly concerning. But Martin's presentation and Stefan's intervention covered key risks of conflict on food security and agriculture. And I don't want to repeat them. And I would also say that those risks are also in line with the FAO's views and assessments. One thing I would like to emphasize is that the importance of monitoring how the individuals and households' food security will be affected. I think Martin showed a very good, interesting and useful result of the recent World Bank survey listening to Uzbekistan. I think this type of household or individual level monitoring is important because the price crisis will be transmitted finally to people's access to food. And in that sense, FAO also made an scenario, not a survey, survey from respondents, individual respondents, but scenarios of shocks, like moderate shocks and severe shocks in terms of reduction of supply in export market. And as you know, FAO is also monitoring the number of chronic undernourishment, or in other term, chronic food insecurity, which is a Sustainable Development Goal target 2.1. And for the extreme scenario, worldwide, 8 million people will fall into chronic undernourishment, in addition to the baseline, which is now almost 800 million. And with moderate scenario, moderate shock scenario, this will be 7.6 million people. And this is an additional figure, which was already increasing before the conflict due to the COVID for the last 2 years. But of course, this is just a scenario. We are not saying that this is going to happen, but the important thing is to understand the possible worst case scenario. And if you allow me, let me just share with you key policy recommendations that FAO would like to make. Let me share the screen. This is just 3 slides. Can you see the screen? Yes. Yeah. So
Yes, we can see.
yeah, thank you. I can also see this. This is very nice. Yeah, FAO's policy recommendation is, of course, to keep trade open for food, fuel, and fertilizer and other inputs. And this graph was developed by IFPRI and published a few weeks ago in Financial Times. And also FAO's chief economist also used this for his recent presentation, because this is telling something very important to look at. The blue line shows the level of export restriction during COVID-19 as share of total exports. And the yellow line shows the level of export restriction during the high food price crisis in 2007 and 8. And the red is where we are today as a result of the grain crisis. That shows 17% of export are restricted. And if this exacerbates the impact on prices and chronic undernourishment I mentioned, will be even larger. So we need to see how we can minimize this. And one of the solutions could be strengthen agricultural market information system, or AMIS. I think Martin also mentioned this very briefly. The purpose of AMIS is to enhance market transparency and encourage international cross-border policy coordination in time of crisis by sharing information real-time basis. And actually, this was launched immediately after the global food price crisis in 2008. And AMIS plays crucial role in strengthening market transparency. But this needs to be strengthened even more by adding more countries' information and more commodities, including oilseeds, agricultural inputs like fertilizers, in the system. And the other recommendation is to increase efficiency in use of fertilizers. This is an example of Ethiopia back in 2003 or 4. And Ethiopia increased the use of fertilizer by 10%, but increase in yield was only 5%. The reason was what they were using was not for the crops and soils, of their land. And this is because they did not have precise soil maps. And when they developed, they had a significant improvement, significant return. And this is not only Ethiopia, many countries did the same. And we need to expand this because this could reduce the intensity of use of fertilizer. And at the same time, we can increase yield. And also it has positive effects on land and water. And a similar topic is food loss and waste. If we can reduce food loss and waste by 50%, there will be sufficient fruits and vegetables throughout the supply chain to cover recommended consumption per capita per day. And as we also seen in fertilizers, this is clearly double win or triple win. More food will be available and reducing chronic undernourishment, better use of land and water, and also reduction of emissions. So yeah, thank you. This is the end of my intervention and presentation. I can also share the slides of FAO policy recommendations through FAO colleagues in Tashkent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kigo. Very good and important points that you made. Now, based on the previous all three presentations and recommendations and their vision, now I want to turn to the room, and yeah, the forecasts are of course showing the risks, and it's good that we see already policy recommendations and the possible ways out of it, and they are mainly coincide with each other. But also a good thing is that we have a practice manager from the World Bank sitting in the room. So let's discuss Fauke. So Martin is saying that and also Kigo was mentioning that the trade has to be open, but at the same time Martin is referring to the thing that we have a good domestic production capacity, both fertilizers and horticulture. But on the other side, we have a kind of a situation where becoming open and integrating to the international markets, and there will be transmission and adjustment to the international level. So the fertilizer price, whether we want or not, it will increase. There will be adjustment. The same will apply for the products, and so the World Bank's expectation that it will continue the impact, and on the other hand, we have some visions as presenters mentioned. Improving the approach, how to use the land, or the increasing the production capacity, etc., etc. So a green approach, innovative. So what do you think? How we can overcome the difficulty, and what's your vision, taking into account of the previous presentations? Just your vision. So you have been here only for a few days, but you have been also looking at different analytical materials and supervising of the issue. So it's very important to know your vision. Please, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you also for the presenters for the very good presentations. They basically already summarizing or pointing you to a lot of the answers to your questions. And, so the situation overall, it is affecting everyone. And I think you have quite a number of tools at hand for Uzbekistan that already helps you looking at the shorter term and the medium term responses. You have, as was mentioned, you have the Listening to Uzbekistan survey that is actually helping how does the situation affect different households, so that can help shape specific answers that you can use to decide, are you going to respond more from an agriculture perspective, or are you going to respond more from a targeted social protection perspective? So you have that information. I think the other element that was mentioned that is very important is to keep monitoring the measures that you're taking, that you're putting in place. So are they working? Are they working in the right direction? How can the agriculture measures, are they increasing the productivity? And in the shorter term, I think there is the elements to think about is in this, when we're expecting, fertilizer and prices to remain high for a couple of years, is there something specific that is needed to submit, to assure that Uzbekistan is producing what it is used to produce, or even can increase its production? But not to forget about the longer term objectives, so not to put measures in place that then derail the vision and that you've started on reforming the agriculture policies and towards a greener, towards a less resource intensive production methods, and addressing climate and resilience challenges. And so that is the balance between the two is tricky, but I think data and information and watching if the measures that you're putting in place are taking hold and are not derailing you is very, very important. And you've already started this process. So as also Martin presented in his presentation, there's a lot already that you have in place that will help you in this. So I think the important part is really whatever shorter term measures you may want to put in place to support farmers in the shorter term shouldn't lead to distractions or distortions on the market in the longer term. And I think one important element also to mention is that the agriculture and food sector is playing a really important role in Uzbekistan also for jobs and job creation. So the more you can actually support the value chains and the sector, the more you're also supporting the job opportunities also in rural areas, which will in turn again help on the affordability of food that was also mentioned, that people have enough in their pockets to afford even food if it is higher priced, as we see the increases are happening. I mean, the other element to mention, I think, is that these trade restrictions that were mentioned by everybody are quite relevant for our region. So the number of trade restrictions that have been put in place in Europe and Central Asia is quite high. So Uzbekistan can also play a role to assure not to put further restrictions themselves, but also to help in the dialogue with other countries to assure that the trade flow is open, because that will make the predictability for everybody much better, and assure that farmers can actually plan accordingly, and that they're not hindered by ad hoc restrictions on their policies. So I'll stop here for now, and I mean we can.
Let me ask one
Yeah.
more thing. You presenters also mentioned, it was I think it was in Kygo's presentation, like 17% of exports are restricted, and it was also mentioned by others. But this is also not a good thing, because in the international trade you have to have a trust, you have to have a predictability, especially for food products. And besides that, we are having lots of disruptions from the transport and logistics and other geopolitical issues. What do you think? So will the architecture of trade and transport logistics system, and maybe I'm not going to touch to the financial things, but so what sort of the message it is sending to countries, and where we have to also in what I mean in which topics we also have to now start to concentrate and work in terms of the finding out different roads and different markets and maybe the transport and logistics, or we have to accelerate our accessions to WTO. And from this perspective, this is very important to know your view in this aspect.
Yeah, I think in many ways, the activities that the World Bank is doing on agriculture and food in Uzbekistan already trying to help the country, your country, in supporting that. So that's why we keep talking not just about agriculture, but agriculture and food value chains, because the logistics and are also very critical. So it's not just about producing more, but it's also about being able to store, transport, and market what you have been producing, be it locally or on the export markets. And so there is a lot that some of the things cannot be addressed necessarily in the short term, but in the medium term. And we've done actually a number of reports and analytics also. We have done a report on horticulture exports potential in Uzbekistan and what the country needs to do to get ready for to access a broader range of markets. And a lot there has to do about food safety, has to do with some public functions on laboratory capacity, on making sure that farmers are getting the information they need to actually understand what market the other markets require, so that they can already produce what is needed. So that requires a lot of collaboration between farmers, aggregators, and exporters eventually, and access to the export market. It has to do with being able to increasingly be able to trace your production systems as this is demanded on the global markets. So you have started to put a lot of things in place. The one element that Martin also mentioned, which keeps being striking, that 70% of the support that is being provided is production support, and less is actually being provided for the public functions that will facilitate trade and will facilitate agricultural productivity. So you're already in the process of starting to make that shift. So you have to continue that path and not being derailed from the current crisis to not continue doing so. Because yes, trade is limited or is restricted at this point in time, but it doesn't mean that we should retract the good policies that are being put in place for the longer term to increase productivity and do it in a sustainable and green way, because there will always be some countries that have a comparative advantage over others for certain products. And that's why your international trade comes in. And I think that, as Martin has been saying, that's where the role of the international institutions is coming in to actually support that dialogue on the global level, that this is actually hurting, these trade restrictions are hurting everybody's, exporters as well as importers.
Very, very helpful. So my understanding is that we have to continue with the policies we have started and continue on areas we have an advantage, relative advantage, and don't derail and maybe don't concentrate on producing some products that might have a less advantage, but continue and open and with open trade.
Yes, just as a short response to that, yes. And that is what also we mean when we're saying repurposing agriculture policies. So a crisis is usually also an opportunity to assess, are we going in the right direction? And then, as you go, it will be very important to keep measuring that you're continuing the path, and that whether the policies you've put in place are actually achieving the goals and objectives that you have set. So that will maintain. So just putting the policy in place doesn't mean it's working. So that element is very critical as well, and to continue on that.
Thank you, Frauke. Now I want to turn to Beate. Beata, you have been working in Uzbekistan for many years, and you have been doing great jobs in terms of, helping and enabling the local agriculture producers from mainly technical support side. But the current, my feeling is that the current situation is putting some extra pressure to you, and that can be felt from our more and I have to say that we started to call to each other more often and often, and it's good, and also it puts some kind of challenge for us, in the sense that we have to accelerate the process of skills training and taking into account the land reform that they have started in Uzbekistan. Land reforms, Sergey, he knows we are approaching this issue not only from the, let's say that the kind of it's a social action, or but it's a reform which has to address at the same time several issues like sustainable jobs, agriculture, sphere development, price stability, and food security, and that requires one issue is that investing in human capital as a skills training in agriculture. Another is that green approach, using the land and the water resource efficiently. And but it's not going to be easy. We started to give the land to from the cotton production to households, and there might be some recommendations, some views from your side. And so what's your view on both skills training side? So how GIZ can help us, in more wider way, so they're helping, but and also how we can address the issues of using the land more efficiently. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Ilham. Thank you, colleagues, for very informative contributions. So we move back to the ground now in Uzbekistan, as Ilham already introduced. The German International Development Corporation is supporting the economic reforms and sustainable economic development in Uzbekistan, mainly focusing on rural areas and in very close cooperation with the Ministry of Economic Development and Poverty Reduction. We have heard that we are facing a situation where agriculture has to become very productive, intensive, sustainable, and still resource saving, because we need these resources also for the next generations of our population. And the population is growing, not to forget. I think we are now reaching, or have already reached, 35 million, and numbers are going up. This shows that for food security purposes, we also realize that during these international crises, it is best to be independent. The land reform and bringing land into production, which has not been productive for the last decades, is very important right now. And as Ilham mentioned, we are working on this very closely. We are kind of piloting several systems and have to figure out which of them works best. One aspect is that if we go for scale, we need to work with big enterprises. So there are a couple of big enterprises in the agricultural sector, and they certainly have a better potential to have an intensive production, to have scale, to get an equal quality, to have better chances for marketing and maybe for export. We are talking a lot about export, I think sometimes too much, because looking at the situation now where trade is restricted, we should also look a bit more into import substitution. Today, we still face a situation that Uzbekistan imports more food products than it exports, which means we are still depending too much. For example, potatoes. There's a very great potential in potato production, but I think we are importing about 70% of the needed potatoes from abroad. I don't think this is necessary, but I say this from an agronomic point of view. The yields are still very low in the potato production areas, and there is still a very high potential for simply increasing the yields. How can we do this with organizing agriculture? I think it's a very difficult question. So I just talked about the big enterprises. Sure, they have a lot of potential. They will also create job places, but will they reach really rural poor? This is a question. What the government is trying now with the new land is to distribute it to households. But now again, we will face a situation that land, which maybe is now in huge areas, it's several thousand hectares, will be split up into very small plots. So how again can we aggregate these farms and households so that they will also have a potential to produce very efficiently? One suggestion from our side is, and we are already actively working on it, to introduce a well-working cooperative system in Uzbekistan. So GIZ is currently even supporting the review of the cooperative law. We hope that it will be approved during this year. We are now looking into possible establishment of village-based agricultural advisory systems so that we have the possibility to reach the small households. We are looking into quality. So sure, also quantity, but quality is very important when we look at working with households. We need certification. If we want to export to maybe European market or also to Asia, we need international certification. And these are all aspects which are starting right now. So we also produce the certification of goods, again, looking at small households. Small households cannot invest into certification because they don't have enough products and they don't have enough income, and certification is expensive. So this again speaks for the cooperative system. So if we bring these small households and small farmers together in cooperatives, actually, this was not correct. I should not say we should bring them together. They should come together. This is a very different approach. As a group, they can invest and they can also afford certification, and they can purchase in bulk, they can sell in bulk. So I think this is for sure a model which will be very useful here in this situation, and which will also boost agricultural production and also quality. I think this is just an overview, so we are working in these directions. I don't want to go into more details. Maybe Ilham, if you have some specific questions, otherwise I think certainly Eric will address this also.
No, it was helpful. So I think we will have to borrow some time from the coffee break, and please forgive me for that. And we have, I think, some Hakim assistants as well participating in this room. It will be very interesting from the cooperative system because it will ask their greater involvement as well. So taking a chance, I want to ask Fauke, and Salman is also here, and Eric. So please have a look at this law, and we will share, and we want to revise this draft of the law because it's very important from the perspective of job creation and poverty reduction as well. And so it's about coordinating our policies in a sense that this is the land reform on one side, the job creation and poverty reduction, and the food security, and also the green approach. So these are the things that we are going to solve from one single mechanism, is like setting up a very efficient cooperative system where we can bring the lands used by the households in a more wise and efficient way of doing. And with this, I want to turn to Eric, because Eric is coming from the setting up aggregator system, because cooperative is good when we have a good aggregator system, and the aggregator is that's what we are mainly discussing, is that to reach very good export markets, not only the traditional neighboring countries, but the markets where we can have a good additional value. And Eric has a good experience in this direction. So Eric, what are the challenges and what are the plans?
I'm not sure I have a lot of experience, but let me share the experience that I do have. Some 30 odd years ago, I was much younger than I am today. And I am Israeli myself, so that's an important piece of background. I got hired by a farmer who had about, I think the farm size was maybe 1 hectare. And I was, the only experience I had was military. I was given training of about 6 hours, I think, how to operate a small farm, how to pick flowers. This was about, not about food security, this was about flowers. How to pick them, how to sort them in different sizes, how to bunch them together, how to put them in buckets, fridge, etc., etc. 6 hours of training, and there I was alone in the field, you know, doing the work. By the time I had enough flowers in my buckets in the fridge, I had a telephone hanging on the wall, a physical telephone, not the kinds we have today, mobile, with a number written on the wall. All I had to do was to pick up the phone, dial the number, and like a few hours later in the evening, there would be a refrigerated truck at the farm gate to pick my flowers and take them to the airport. Now, I didn't know how the system actually worked. For me, it was a sort of miracle, you know, that I, you know, sit on a tiny little farm and somehow the system works for me. And these flowers, later I discovered, were flown all the way to Amsterdam and sold at the biggest flower exchange in the world at the time for a good price, I hope, or I believe. You know, my employer got paid, I get paid. You know, the supply chain proved its worth. So that was the experience I had at the time. Later on, when I reflected on this experience, I started asking myself the question how this kind of system was created in Israel. And it's very much grounded in certain traditions that Israel had, which go all the way back to maybe some socialist, you know, planned economy sort of style beginnings of Israeli agriculture. It's a very unique institutional setup whereby the state steps in and creates a public-private partnership with the associations of growers, of producers, and essentially creates the entire logistics systems to take Israeli product, whether it's vegetables or fruit, like the most famous is, of course, oranges, and take them to export markets. Now, problem with this type of institutional arrangements is that they don't travel well. So if you think this is a fantastic model and I can replicate it in Uzbekistan tomorrow, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. I remember in 2011, when I was an economist in Georgia, the Georgian government, it was beginning of 12 actually, the Georgian government at the time decided, okay, we have to do something for our agriculture. We cannot allow the private sector to do it all. So they stepped in with their own aggregation system, and they started buying the mandarins from the Ajarian farmers, from your friend Levan. And the problem was that the Georgian government didn't necessarily have the expertise, you know, how to aggregate, how to package these mandarins. So in the end, what happened, they collected a whole lot of them, put them in boxes, cardboard boxes that wasn't exactly of the right type. And so the whole cargo collapsed on the way to Ukraine. And, you know, you can imagine when boxes collapse on each other, there's not much worth left in the boxes. So all of it went into, was dumped somewhere. So institutions don't travel well. And the question is, what kind of institutions can work in Uzbekistan? When I first arrived in Uzbekistan in 2010, I was walking around the neighborhoods and I was walking around in Samarkand, went to see the Jewish synagogue there. One feature that struck me was that it's incredibly clean. You know, you don't find any piece of rubbish on the street. And I was like, wow, how can it be? It's certainly not a terribly developed country. I mean, when you look at people's incomes and all that, statistics. So I went to the World Bank and I talked to your colleague, Eskander Trushin, and I told him my experience, you know, tell me what is going on. And the guy explains, well, we have the Mahallah. We have the Mahalla system, whereby everybody, it's not just private individuals at atoms, atomized society. It's actually, an organized society. We have communities everywhere, in cities, in rural areas, and they take care of their own, environment. And it struck a chord with me because I came from Georgia, which is an incredibly atomized society. Nothing works. No communal system works. Everyone for himself. I said, wow. So I come here in 2021, and in February we met Ilhom, you and Deputy Prime Minister Jamshed Kuchkarov, and we started talking about mahallas. We started talking about aggregation systems, and we started thinking, what can we do to make these systems work? And next week, the week after we met, Ilhom and I, and also Beata, we went to Fergana. We went to Fergana city. We went to Andijan to see, how aggregators work in Uzbekistan. And so in Alti Arik region, the very first meeting we had, the very first visit we had, we meet a guy, Nuruddin, I forget his family name right now, and he is, is the middle of a mahalla. The guy has a little company that does logistics of exports to Russia primarily. He inherited 10, 15 trucks from his father. He has cold storage. He has, some resources to put into his business. And he's one of the guys of the mahalla. Now, everybody employed in his business are part of his community. So he cares about them. And, everybody work in the cold storage, in the logistics chain, the truck drivers, in the fields. He has people operating 400 hectares of vineyards, family by family, 400 hectares, 1 hectare a family. Everybody work, and there is a secure buyer for all of their product. All of it goes into cold storage immediately from the field. Nothing is spoiled. And then it's, put in proper packaging and delivered to X5 or, a proper retail network in Russia in that case. And the guy cares. The guy cares about his community. We talked to him and he was telling us, look, I can only provide jobs in a season, which is about 6 months. What do I do with the rest of the time? There are people who are willing to work. I'm willing to employ them. I'm thinking right now of starting an additional production line, which will not be about food, will not be seasonal. It will be about some metal works, because there are people around who are building, vineyards, and they need some equipment. So I'm going to do that. This will create extra jobs for me, for my community, and it will be a fantastic contribution to the rest of the Fergana Valley area. I'm going to do that. So for me, it was an ideal example of how, a local institution, a mahalla, coupled with an entrepreneurial guy, a leader of the community, can make it all work. It doesn't require the state to involve. It doesn't require, costly investment by anybody. There are enough entrepreneurial talent in Fergana Valley. There's enough hardworking people to make it all work. We just have to make sure there are the conditions, the basic conditions for them to operate. Let me give you an example of a basic condition that is not there for the moment. And this is something that we are EBRD, I didn't say that, but I work for the EBRD. This is something that we are trying to fix. It's a very simple thing, doesn't cost nothing. It's a regulation. One problem aggregators face in a high season is working capital. They need cash, and they need a lot of cash because they're competing for the product. They have to buy the grapes, they have to buy the tomatoes, they have to buy the cherries right now. And so they're competing for the product. There's not enough of it. There are a lot of small guys who are, trying to buy. And so you need cash. Now, once you buy and you sell your shipment, 2 trucks, 5 trucks, to whichever destination, it takes you 60 days to get paid, maybe more. And you need more cash. The seasonal is only 1 month long. And so for the moment, what is called the factoring finance system doesn't work in Uzbekistan. Banks cannot step in. They cannot accept your accounts receivable, which is what it is, as collateral. So it gets very costly. And you have to, in some cases, people take capex loans to finance their working capital. This is incredible. It's very easy to fix. You don't need to invest almost anything, just one consultant. And then a quick action, parliament and government, and there you go. The same on the flip side of it is something called reverse factoring. This is the same idea, but applied to your suppliers. So if you, when you buy the raw material from cooperatives or from individual farmers, again, you need cash, you don't have it. So the banks can provide the cash. The banks can provide the cash, and they can be an electronic platform to facilitate this reverse factoring idea, that immediately you go with your truck, with your procurement expert, you go to the field, you buy 2 tons of whatever it is, and immediately in the application, in your phone, you indicate, I owe this guy 2,000 tons worth of grapes, and I took the product. So the bank immediately initiates a payment, and there you go. Small things, very quick things that can be fixed, and I think we will allow aggregators to do a much better job. And on top of that, there are the labs, certification. You can go into maybe organic. You can do all kinds of things if you have the systems in place. And it can be based and should be based on local ideas, local traditions, and local institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, you know, it brings me again to the important topic that we have been discussing these 2 days about the coordination. And we are going to the second phase of rural development, rural entrepreneurship support program. And so Marco is here, and Deputy Prime Minister also announced that we are going to launch a new platform for SME development. Now these 2 main topics, they are coming together, and then we have to think how to coordinate and then merge, basically, this. We started from food security, job creation, and now going to SME, and I don't know how we can. So we have to think on this, and that's the one topic that emerged during this discussion, and what we can do. Good coordination. The resources are here, experts are here, but how we have to this optimally place, or do a kind of a role sharing. And on this and other issues and the presentations, Sergey, you have been as a good expert, you have been working on agriculture development and food security issues closely with Uzbekistan, and you know the situation very good. And so what's your reflection, and maybe you have some additions to say?
Thank you very much. There were a number of the pleasant surprises at the conference, the Poverty Forum, in terms of the topics we discussed, which for the observers of Uzbekistan for a couple of years has been a pleasant surprise on taboo questions, right? The overall poverty reduction a couple of years ago was difficult to discuss, and others. The second surprise, and the pleasant surprise for me personally, has been participating in the panel discussion with my PhD supervisor. So Stefan von Kramon, the gentleman from University of Göttingen, Stefan, I hope you hear me, is my PhD supervisor. So it was nice to be in the same place, but in different places at the same time.
And just for Bukhara was one of the main points of the Great Silk Road. So it was a kind of a crossing road for trade,
the meeting place.
Meeting place. World is small, and the
Yes.
tradition is becoming alive again.
Thank you very much. So, but on the global food security and implications for Uzbekistan, couple reflections from my side is that it's challenging for the government, because one has to decide, is this temporary shock or it's permanent shock? Beate talked about it. It's better to be independent. And I think if it's permanent shock, so it's going to stay for us for a long time, yes. If it's temporary shock for a couple of years, which I call temporary shock, that is better to be linked to the global markets. Because still, comparative advantage of the market economy works at the end of the day. The challenge of the food security in Uzbekistan has been that farmers received for too many years very low prices. And the food security was compromised by government policy to keep farm prices low in order to keep consumer prices low. And the government did a great change of minds of thinking of consumers through the social safety net and other instruments, but actually giving farmers a chance to finally deliver on food security and to invest. And the precondition for that for farmers to receive market prices. Without farmers receiving market prices, food security is impossible in Uzbekistan. If it's possible, you will be one of all of the countries in the world who reach that. It's very challenging in the current environment when world market prices are high and volatile to accept it. But this is how it works. And that's why we talk about these temporary instruments which you have in place: social safety net, public stocks, state fund for the export, where the temporary interest rate subsidy can be increased to farmers to produce for the next couple of seasons more wheat, for example. You have those instruments, and they are more valuable in the current volatile environment than they were a couple of years ago. Second reflection is that when prices go up for consumers, it's the reason of the current global food crisis, heightened food prices, is aggression of Russia on Ukraine. It's not the fault of Uzbekistan government. And I think it has to be explained that way. So you can do something, but you cannot completely eliminate the effect on the global markets. And that's important for population also, not to expect everything for the government to fix as it was. It doesn't work that way. I think if prices, domestic prices increase, and they are the same increase on the global market, the government is doing a good job. But if the local prices increase is above global market price increase, then one has to look and see what the government can do better in terms of high marketing costs, high capital costs, high logistics, how we can invest to reduce the local prices. But if the local prices increase in the same way or smaller than international prices, the government is doing a good job. And you have to communicate that better only in at times when your prices exceed global food price increase. Then this is some area to look. And the final reflection is that Stefan talked about challenge in Europe, about food and biofuels, and about feed and food. I think there are a couple of challenges in Uzbekistan in that respect. First challenge is the crop placement system, and I think it has pluses and minuses, but some challenge, and because we call it challenge because it has many political implications and changing of minds. But second challenge, which is more sort of, for some people, it's maybe not the challenge, but it's white meat consumption. And I think we go a bit into the technical area, but this is challenge of consumer minds. Consumers have certain perceptions. And the reality is that most consumers in Uzbekistan prefer red meat. But you don't have capacity to produce red meat for growing population. You don't. What you have capacity is to have more production of white meat, which is poultry, fish. But that's require consumers to be pioneers of that demand. You don't have sufficient land and water to satisfy all of those requirements. And for the health and nutrition reasons, white meat is more, it's better for health, globally researched. But this is long-term challenge. But there are many of these challenges as European governments is facing to convince their consumers and farmers to make choices. The same is in Uzbekistan. It's not one-year deal, but it's long-term strategy. And the Livestock Committee is working on it to change perceptions which matter for food security. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And it seems that, we have a lot to say to each other, but, because of the time constraint, and but I hope we will continue, and thank you very much for participants. I will do some kind of concluding remarks, and I will not repeat all of them. The risks are there, and we will face the challenge, but together, by working in a coordinated way, we can overcome and minimize or mitigate their impact on economy, especially the social condition of the people. And the important thing is that continue with the policy that we started, and invest in training and education, and also by building a strong social safety network, carry on with the trade integration and trade liberalization, let the trade flows open, and also pay attention from the perspective of agriculture development and SME development on coordinating. So we have the resource there, and we have to work together. And with this, I want to close this panel session and thank very much to all participants. Thank you.
Good to see you, Stefan.
Good to see you too.
Thank you, Stefan.